Welcome back to A Penny for Your Thoughts. We are on the Purdue University campus with Dr. Shaun Casteel. We had an awesome science episode talking
Good
about
nerd out
soybeans.
session.
Yeah,
Yes.
good nerd out session, talking about some really cool science. But excited to be back and talk about management in soybeans, and certainly top of mind for a lot of reasons that we'll get into. But
I'm waiting for this. You kept saying there's going to be something personal. I was like, I don't know if I know you that well. I want to know you that well.
Well, I don't know if I even want to read it. So when we were getting ready for this, Andrew goes, wait, and then proceeded to handwrite whatever I'm about to.
And actually, I just realized I typed it up.
So am I supposed to read it twice?
No, you just do your intro, however you want.
Well, welcome to A Penny for Your Thoughts. Talking to Dr. Shaun Casteel at the University of Purdue. Great conversations around science behind soybeans. I'm Sean Bloomgren, and I'm currently trying to bring back jorts and mullets.
Jorts, huh?
I will say my favorite night at the state fair is East Side night. So I don't. That actually probably is. Dr. Casteel, how old are your kids?
11, 9, and 7.
Okay, and boys or girls?
2 girls and a boy.
So would you allow jorts and a mullet? Is that the
Party in the back, business up front?
Yeah,
You got it.
Yeah. That's what.
Jorts.
Yeah.
Jorts. All I can see is, oh gosh, is it Will Ferrell doing the little bit on that?
Yeah.
With Jimmy Fallon? Is that who's doing it? Yes, I wear jorts.
Oh, man, this is good. We can get serious now for a minute.
And since I haven't read it, I don't even actually know where we're starting. So
let's start with some.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're here to talk soybean management, and we got one of the soybean gurus himself here, Dr. Shaun Casteel. I'm curious. We got this big shift, and you kind of brought this up. I can't remember if it was on the actual episode or before we started recording. We have a lot of the Corn Belt's talking about and kind of experiencing the shift, planting soybeans first before corn. How's that conversation going for you in Indiana?
Yeah, I think it's not a conversation. It's just that's the norm.
It's
right?
happening.
Yeah, and so I grew up in Illinois, and so when we were raising corn and soybeans, and I was on the farm, as you get the corn in, and then you get the beans in whenever it's fit, maybe by Memorial Day, right? And so that mentality across the Midwest had been there for a good number of years. I came here in 2009, and kind of we're looking at planting. It's just some good management things to look at, and said, we need to rethink this. And so I started looking at the data from 2010, 2017 on the average, our Indiana producers were about 10 to 14 days after corn. So in other words, corn got planted and then our soybean acres started rolling in about 10 to 14 days later. 2018, we saw this shift. We were within about 5 days of corn planting, and that was 5 to 6 days for a few more years. And then, about 2021, thereabouts, we're within a day, and we're pretty much in mirror. The other part about this, and not that this is the end-all be-all, because I can think of, again, I'm pulling back on the long in the tooth, the wisdom acres here, but 2012 was one of our fastest planted crops, early planting. That's not the only thing that makes a crop. Obviously, you got to have rain and everything else, and so we were off on that yield because of the drought year, but when I look at 2018, 2020, 2021, 23, every single one of those years were a fast planted pace. We continued to break state record yields. Like every time we went to 58, went to 58 and a half, went to 59, went to 60. Those all coincided with our fast planted years.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there, how do you think about, and you kind of touched on this too, it seems like the last few years we got some growers going to an early to try and get harvest started, kind of separate their corn and soybean harvest. But the last few years we've had a lot of situations where there's 9-10% soybeans and dry corn as well. How do you start thinking about and advising growers to, if we're trying to reduce the amount of 10% soybeans we harvest and yet we're planting early, how do you advise them to think about maturity?
Well, I go back to, all right, planting timely is a big part of the early beans early, however you want to couch it, right? I think we always want to spread our risk, and so spreading our risk with varieties and maturity groups is a good starting point. I think spreading our risk in terms of harvest timing is good, and then now let's interlace, can we catch old market price, right? That's something else, right? So you plant it early being early, now you can also play the game not just agronomically, but economically. Can you catch an old market price and get things rolling? So I think there's value there. That 9-10% grain moisture is something that's so frustrating in soybeans. I mentioned to you guys earlier, if there's one thing I could do, actually two things. I said, if there's a product that we can apply to kind of hold beans where they are, that's one. I think an easier one is, let's shift. Okay, here we go. Instead of 13% being our target as an industry, why is it not 10%? You know, if we had 10% as our target, again, industry is not going to change. I know that. But you think about corn, you can harvest that thing when it's 25, 26. Who cares? Bring it in. If someone brings in a load of 14.5% beans, depending on the elevator, like, nope, I don't want it yet. I was like, really? We got a percentage point and a half? That's ridiculous. Soapbox stopped. All right, so moving back over, I think that to manage that, I mean, we do have to have different maturity groups, spread the risk. I think about being timely with those. You mentioned, Shaun, earlier about some green stems to be aware that we're going to have fields that are fit even though they don't look it, and so to be able to pull that trigger a little bit earlier than you might want to, so then we can get in and get 12, 13, 14%. If we were to do, I've done these numbers, it's not hard math, but if we looked at a 70, 75 bushel field that was cut at 13%, and then now 5 hours later or 5 days later it's at 10%, that's 3 bushels per acre that's lost just on water weight alone. So think about that as we manage that crop.
That's some money.
It's definitely some money. You mentioned in the science episode, and I called out that it was intentional. You mentioned timely planting. And so would you maybe do our listeners a favor and talk about what conditions do you say, okay, it's now timely?
Sure.
What has to be present for you to feel?
Sure. Yeah, so when we get into this, general sweet spots across the Midwest is where, and again, I'm Indiana-based, right? Mid-Aprils are a good general sweet spot, plus or minus that week, right? And then we kind of think through how does that look on field to field. And so if we've got fields that are heavy residue, that's going to behave differently versus those that had vertical till or some level of tillage. And so you think about warm-up. I mean, those warm-up curves are totally different if you got strip till. So you've got to put that in context. I mean, the rule of thumb that every agronomist passes to the next agronomist is 50 degrees, right, in soil temperatures. I think that we need to look at that loosely. I think that we need to also look at forecast. And so then do we have access to soil moisture when we get it in there? And then, okay, can that process of germination start? And if it can, before we have this drop down, I think we're okay. It's usually that first 12 to 24 hours if someone's worried about cold water. That's really what we're talking about with these earlier plantings is cold water that's being imbibed. When we have that cold water, that's what's really going to cause potential inhibitional chilling, and then as well as some of the seedling diseases. So the next part of this timely planting is you better have a fungicide seed treatment that's packaged for your field. So whether you got Phytophthora issues or you got Pythium, those have to be a part of this story. If we're planting timely with naked seed, that's not a good recipe either.
Absolutely. I'm one of the flaws in Andrew's comedy routine is I don't know the question, so now I'm just intuitively asking the things I want to know.
It's a conversation. You're not a robot, Shaun.
Absolutely.
This is not AI generated. Believe me.
So going back to that idea of going back to the idea of timely planting, then so soil moisture is obviously a huge component of germination and ultimately emergence. It seems like some springs were saturated. We've had a couple years where we've been pretty dry. The rule of thumb has always been, we want to be equally in moisture, right? That way we're that process is uniform, or at least reasonably uniform. What's the deepest you'd plant a soybean to chase moisture before you say, no, let's actually raise them up and keep them out of moisture if that's our option?
Sure.
Hey.
Great question.
Hey, thank you.
Great
I appreciate that. That was a good question. I don't know if it's on the list. But
It actually is, I think, right?
it is. I don't know.
Let's start off with, have you guys ever spilled soybeans in the gravel lot, and have they grown?
I've never spilled a seed.
Oh, man, well,
I'm 44.
I actually had a Dodge pickup truck, and it had a rubber mat in the back of it.
Sure.
And I'm not kidding. It was like June, and I'm like, what on earth is going on? And so spilled soybeans had gotten under the rubber mat, and that held enough moisture. They were trying to grow, like they were lifting the mat up because they were growing underneath of the. So.
Well, Shaun, did you catch that Andrew has never spilled a seed? So what that means, I take that as he hasn't done the work.
Correct.
That's the way I look
Correct.
at that.
He has very, very soft hands for an agronomist. He is not a, he gets
some truth
everybody
to
else to
that.
do his work for him. Yeah.
So the point of that is that, I mean, soybeans will grow as long as there's water available, right? You've got a gravel lot. You can go out to our diesel tanks out there. I was filling up the combine 2 weeks ago, and there's a little soybean plant that someone had spilled at some point that's still growing right there. And so it's about access to moisture, and I think that's the biggest thing. You talk about too wet of feet. Yeah, we definitely don't want too wet of feet. So my general starting point on soybeans is 1.5 inches is a good place for me to be. I've seen plenty of planters. I go out there, and they are dusting it in. Yes, the beans can grow there. I am not a fan of that at all. So that 3/4 inch, an inch, that's awfully shallow for me. And what I go back to in particular is if I'm that shallow, all right, when that radical comes out, all right, and you have root hairs right there, that's where your first nodules form, right? A root hair is just simply bradyrhizobium that the nodules that bradyrhizobium infect those root hairs. And so as soon as that radical comes out, that's where your first nodules are. Give it 30 days to grow, and then another 30 days for nitrogen supply. If we get a June that's hot and dry, guess what's happening to that upper inch of soil? We mentioned it in the science episode, right? In a crazy hot year, right? It's going to dry out. That's one. For two, it's going to be hot. And so in that, your nodulation and fixation supply goes down, right? So that's another reason, just thinking outside of just stand establishment, it's, okay, what am I doing for nodulation and nitrogen supply? Now switch it to the deeper side. How deep? I mean, I'm a flatlander that grew up on flat black dirt, right? And I've had experiences, you know, in sands in North Carolina and in clays and everything else and mucks. And so you've got to put that in context. I still, again, here's full disclosure. I do make mistakes, right? As an agronomist, right? I have spilled a few seeds.
You're clearly doing the work then.
Yeah, clearly we've established that. You have to make mistakes to do the work, right? I remember going to a sand field and planting, and it's like, oh, sand's loose, I'll be fine. And I'll chase the moisture a little bit. I went down 1 3/4 inches. That was the worst thing I could have done on that field because we had enough down pressure that, I mean, it crusted it over. It had enough compaction. It just did not emerge. And so, again, you have to understand how those field conditions change, and it's not just about depth, but it's also about how does that soil or residue change in terms of the way that plant grows and develops. Let's also put it in the context of the way soybeans grow, right? They're not a lance shooting through like a corn plant. Corn, I don't think you can set the planter deep enough that it'll have an issue, right? It'll eventually pull through it, right? Soybeans, if we're down to 2-3 inches, there's cases that can, and there's cases, a lot of cases, they're going to just flat break their necks.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's funny because it's kind of a pun, right?
Yeah.
That's like, is that like a dad joke?
I suppose it is.
A soybean.
I suppose it is.
Soybean agronomist joke.
Not as good as that one earlier. But
Okay, I'm going to go back to the script now. Is there a consistent response to later maturity beans? Should we be pushing to the later side of our maturity for our region or our growing zone?
So with that, let's just think in a general sense. You go back to Agronomy 101 class, wherever you took it, Illinois, Iowa State, wherever, maybe even Kentucky. We'll bring them into the mix, or NC State, right? So you think about just in general, you're trying to do what with your season? Harvest as much sunlight as possible. So in that general conversation, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and put it fullest season, and that's what I was taught as well. Get the fullest maturity out there so then you can have as much season and harvest as much sunlight, so that can also translate to seed production. I think what we have to do, though, is what is the yield potential and yield consistency? I don't think just a full season variety by itself is going to be the end all. I've seen enough in the last 5 to 10 years that there's early beans that yield exceptionally well because they've got the yield potential over the full season. So I don't think we can couch it as easy as give me a fuller season versus an early season. I think, okay, how does it perform? Does it have the yield consistency? Here in this region, I'd say a full season for us is a 3.8. I dare say a lot of our 3.1s to 3.3s, maybe 3.5s are out yielding those, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's about the yield potential that comes into that package.
So when we start talking about not wanting to combine 10% corn, maybe focus less on the yield potential and expanding our maturities based on that, but expand it more for reducing that risk. Widening that combine window, reducing the risk for potentially all of your beans to be 10% versus
So that's a different question, right? And this is a problem that Shaun didn't know where you were going with the question, and so
I didn't either.
I very rarely ever know where he's going, just so we're clear.
if we're looking to manage the grain moisture, right, certainly let's have the mix, right? Let's have the mix of the planting date, the maturity groups, and all that, so then we can spread the risk. But let's also have the reality of roughly if we go an April 15th planted bean versus a May 15th planted bean, same variety, what kind of a maturity difference? When is that going to mature come September, October? Is it 4 weeks? No. 1 week roughly, about 4 to 1 roughly, depending on what your early season growth is right. So
heat and all that, yeah.
so all that, so about a 4 to 1 ratio. So planting date can do that. If you want to bring in maturity group loosely, same planting date. Let's go with an April 25th planted, a 3-1. Let's go 2-8 versus a 3-8, a full maturity group unit. What does that mean at the end of the season? Roughly 7 to 10 days. So that's what you're dealing with. 7 to 10 days, maybe some maturity group. So you're gaining in this play of, okay, I'm spreading the risks and grain moisture. It's 7 to 10 days is what you're getting. So you might catch a few fields, but in the end, they're going to a lot be, okay, we're running whatever. If we've been 6-7 weeks of dry weather and just hope for a little bit of rain to give us a little bit of moisture back.
It's all going to be dry.
Yep.
Yeah.
The cruddy part about all that is, okay, we can withstand. I don't like 10% beans. I don't like less than 13%. We can still have all those beans coming in, dry weight, fine. We were losing out on the water weight. But what really hurts is whenever we start to get into these wet, dry cycles, right? And so if we got a bean that is mature, we catch a rain, then we dry out, that's when we start to worry about dehiscence. That's when we start to worry about shatter at the head and those kind of things.
Yep.
I don't know if I know how to ask this question the right way, so I'm going to fumble through it, and then you can add to it maybe if I am not clear. When we think about hybrid maturity in corn or relative maturity in corn, it seems like if we push our maturity to the later side, it seems like we can endure the typical heat in August kind of through that green fill period. And we've talked about the ability to kind of endure the stress days, the days where overnight temps are too high or daytime temps. Do soybeans respond similarly to that, or is the kind of infinite variability remove that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I mean, obviously you have maturity groups for a reason, so then they go through flowering, they go through development, seed fill, and finish, at different times, and that's why we have them. It goes back to what is the stress that you're trying to avoid or trying to manage, right? And so if it is some level of heat late, there's times if you catch that rain, you're going to withstand that, but there's also times that rain just still came too late, and I was better to mature that crop before that heat wave came through, right? If we go back and we start looking at, I think, the September weather that we've had in the last 10-ish years, I dare say that we have more sunlight than we used to, better temperatures, and so trying to mature that crop during that period, we haven't caught as much rain, and so I think that's where these early beans planted early are really shining, regardless of the grain moisture side of it.
Yeah.
It's strange because I think at least 3 years in a row, we've actually had a relatively cool August, and then we get that spike in early September, which has been, a
Makes
newer
beans
phenomenon.
do some weird things.
Yeah, we talked about this in the science episode a little bit of the population impact, and how physiologically that impacts the soybean plant. But talk, if you would, just about kind of your recommendations for populations as growers think about soybeans.
Yeah, populations again. This is about, okay, have enough plants out there that you can have a good establishment, good root systems, and then have the opportunity for yield potential, right? So that's obviously you got to have out there. You think about herbicide-resistant weeds, so that's part of it. We jokingly said it used to be 180,000, 200,000. That was cheap weed control years and years ago. But we don't have that option anymore. So starting point agronomically, 140,000 seed rate with a planter. Again, 15s, 20s, what have you, 30s. I don't care. If we want to bring the economics into it, we're probably going to be around that 120-ish. And again, if we have fields and soils that are different, I think about some of our muck fields. We got some muck fields. I'm to drop that down because they can get really rank again. So if we get too much population out there, they're pushing each other really tall. They lodge over, they get rank. So I want to do a lower seed rate on those type of situations, and then kind of complete the story. If we have anyone running the air seeders and drills, I'm going to be a higher rate, 175,000 give or take.
Does Mother Nature, start having these conversations? I guess too. Do you like variable rate planting in soybeans?
I've done the seed rate trials to say, okay, we've got the variations across the field. I think you've got to have some really strong variability in your field to really recommend that. And so I think about some fields in particular. We got some mucks and sands in the same field. That variability makes a lot of sense. I think about any slight roll to the ground topography, probably not that big of a deal. We can probably just run a static 120,000, call it good. We get the crawdad soils down the southeast. Those I've maxed out. This is going to sound like a crazy number. I've maxed out yields at 60,000 population, plant population, not seed rate. So now what does it take to get there, right? But 60,000, I don't gain anything more. And so it's pretty wild when you think about that, and had really no need to adjust the seed rate across those fields.
So you kind of touched on it, the soil texture and maybe the water holding capacity, some of that stuff impacts your planting population.
Yeah, if I was to write a script, in particular, if I've got something that's wildly different in the same field, so I'm going to say a muck, right, to a sand, wildly different, yeah, I'm definitely going to be thinking about a VR in that. Okay. If I'm talking about it's more or less a loam or it's a good prairie dirt, I just don't see the need to variable rate that.
Does your environmental conditions, like growers know the fields or the areas where you'll typically shut off rain, if you got a certain area within the state, within wherever you are, there it's typically dry July,
Sure.
June, July. Does that change your?
I think I go back to the initial part is what stand establishment like, and so I'm going to couch it a little bit more that we know that these fields have wet feet in May and June, and so no matter what, we're going to have Pythium or we're going to have Phytophthora. Those are probably the ones I might just up the seed rate a little bit in addition to the fungicide seed treatments. Now, if we're going to get into the dry scenario in the July and August, I'm going to say, what can I do to get a good root system established to weather that and not have a lot of plant-to-plant competition? So I'm probably going to try to plant earlier or timely and get those established so then they can have that deep root system that we want.
Yep.
Growing up, we were always told that August rains make soybean yields. Is that still true?
August and September is how I put it.
August and September.
And the work, it was a fun time. So back in, we had 60 cultivars from the maturity group 2, 60 cultivars from maturity group 3. So from 1920s to mid-2012s or so, I think, back when we did this work. And so we're looking at growth habits and patterns and nutrient changes. And the old lines, right, they were getting into R6 and they had most of their nitrogen accumulated, and at that point, and then they put on a little bit more. Our modern lines had shifted. They didn't have as much nitrogen and sulfur and dry weight in the pods and seeds at R6. They had less, maybe 45, 50% at that point. And then when they went to maturity, they went up to 85%. So they had a linear increase in terms of dry weight putting on, nitrogen accumulation, sulfur accumulation. And so that's where I say it is in August and September because our modern beans are doing much more later in the season. And so later in development in particular.
Similar to corn, actually. Interesting.
Shaun's favorite crop.
It is.
It is.
We touched on residue at the end of our science episode, and you were particularly talking about distribution of residue and gave some pretty cool facts about how that's impacting it. How do you see it? I guess maybe talk about the impact of residue kind of through the whole system. So emergence, plant variability, ultimately yield, nutrient availability, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so in terms, again, we're going to make the assumption that we're a corn-soybean type rotation. We're going to go ahead and say the residue we're talking about is corn residue. Let's go and put all that out there. Stand establishment is huge. That's one that we want to think about timely planting. Again, these foundational things. And so if we've got all this residue, what is it doing up front? We've got cooler soils, we've got wet soil, so we've got to be able to manage that. So whether that's some level of tillage, vertical till, or some level of row cleaners or something like that, we've got to work through that so then we can get the soybeans established. And the sooner we can get those established, we have more opportunities for nodal development, on pod development, root development, all that comes into play. Let's go now with the next system of, okay, if we got all this residue, there's good to it, right? There's a mulching layer. There's good that comes out of that. When you think about, okay, that August and September rains or the lack thereof can make or break the crop. And so if you've got the residue there to help with some water holding capacity, that's great. So what can I do to establish a crop to get good root systems and then hold on to that water later? That's one. Another one is the nutrient supply. I've seen this year in and year out that we've got the areas that got heavy residue. We've got a lot of carbon that's being put into that system. You think about, again, this microclimate effect with cool temperatures, wet feet, what's going on beyond just soybeans. We count on microbes in those activity, right? If we don't have the temperature, so if we got too much water, we have issues there. And so we count on, soybeans get nitrogen from organic matter. They get it from what? Nodulation. And oh, by the way, nodulation needs sulfur, and sulfur comes from, well, only 5 pounds from the atmosphere now instead of 20. And if we're getting it from organic matter, the way we're getting it from organic matter is mineralization, microbial mediated again. But if we got all this residue, and we've seen this, is that we have too much carbon and we've had a cool environment, we limit our nutrient supply, in particular nitrogen and sulfur. And so that has a cascading effect on soybean yields.
Yeah.
The sulfur component makes me think, when we think about residue management, so it seems like one of the most practical solutions has been some 32 following the corn harvest, right, to start that process, balance the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Would there potentially be a benefit of using ATS in that to have more sulfur availability for the soybeans the following year?
Yeah, so I think the sulfur is a huge one that's been part of my program for a number of years, and I think we need to kind of walk through a little bit, okay, what's the purpose of that application? If you're doing ATS to prime the microbes to break down, okay, maybe, but think about ATS. If you've got that ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, the sulfur component, let's go with that, is thiol, right? That has to be oxidized. Oxidation is another microbial mediated process. And a lot of people's like, well, I'll put it out in the fall. And I've got 5 months. Well, yeah, but microbial mediated,
Four of them are in the middle of winter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You still need temperature. In particular, you need warm temperature, not just 50 degrees. You need quite warm temperatures to get that oxidized. And so I think form makes a lot of sense in this discussion. If you're looking at to try to help with microbial degradation of the residue, I haven't done that work. I think it would be interesting to do like an ammonium sulfate or something like that. Might be a nice play if we're trying to overcome the potential carbon immobilization that the stover can bring. Give me a soluble sulfur product. And so again, whether that's going to be an ammonium sulfate, ATS is fine. It's not quite as high in my work as ammonium sulfate or pelletized gypsum, but those are some good options to think about.
Yeah. Where do you like your pH for soybeans? And does that change knowing that you're in a corn soybean rotation?
I'm usually, give me the low sixes is a good general spot to be, right? And you can think about how that might change a little bit if you've got some different buffering capacity or you got more of the organics or versus the mineral soils. But usually low sixes are going to be fine. If we go into mid fives, right, it's not only the effect that we all should have on nutrient availability just in that soil, but go back to what are we thankful that we do not have to apply fertilizer for on soybeans? It's the nitrogen, right? And so if we're really trying to boost that system and make sure nodulation is doing its job, the bacteria, Bradyrhizobium, if you're on mid fives and lower, they're not as efficient. They do not perform well. So it's not just, okay, nutrient availability, chemistry from the soil, but it's also how does Bradyrhizobium interact and act efficiently in a low pH versus low sixes.
Yeah. We're getting close, I think, to switching and maybe talking a little bit more about like high yield management or maybe some yield chaser type mentality in soybeans. But one thing I'd like to do before we do that is if you'd think about the bucket of, I'm just going to call it standard grower practice for soybeans, if I'm in the standard yield environment, right?
Sure.
60, 70, 80 bushel. What are your absolute must-haves? So we talked about a population of 120 to 140. You've mentioned a seed-applied fungicide, right, in a lot of the Corn Belt soils. What else, if you're standard grower practice, do you say growers need to really be considering, not necessarily chasing 100 bushel soybeans, but just the standard practice?
What I call the foundations, right? You think about all that goes into this. I mean, we've touched a little bit on it, but I mean, it's variety selection. So those that can have the yield consistency and the yield potential that are fit for your fields, right? And so whether that is the type of soil that you run, or there is disease pressure that you need to think about, or nematode pressure, I mean, those are ones that we definitely have to nail and hit straight out of the gate. If it's a seed treatment, for us in Indiana, Illinois, I mean, the fungicides are a nice play. Do we need the next level? I don't see that every one of those fields needs the next level of what that newest fungicide seed treatment is, but make sure it matches up. Timely planting, again, these are things that we can really just, if we do those, you've got Mother Nature to help you out to still have that 60 bushel, 70 bushel field can go to an 80 or 90 if Mother Nature helps you, right? So timely planting, and then I go also to give me some level of a narrow row, and so 15s-ish is a good spot to be. If we look at 15s versus 30s, we're averaging 5 to 10% yield advantage just on that change alone, right? If we're on 15s versus 30s, it's 5 to 10% easy.
Interesting.
Can you expand on where's that yield benefit coming from?
On the narrow row, or the row spacing, so a lot of it comes into, okay, we've got harvesting sunlight. That's a big part of it. You think about canopy closure, weed control, right? I didn't mention weeds, but I mean, it should be an obvious one with this standard management, right? We can't just grow average-looking beans or high-yielding beans without controlling the weeds. But if you're to do the comparison of two plantings of 15s versus 30s, both with the same planter. Let's do it that way so we're not introducing issues with planter differences. You're going to close the row about 25 days faster with the 15-inch row. So you think about this idea of
you said
25 days.
25, wow.
25 days, all right? So all you're doing is planting on 15s. You're going to close the row 25 days faster. You're helping with what? Weed control. You're helping with light interception. You're helping with water conservation because you're not having evaporation, right? So all that comes into play. The nostalgic gene comes out in me, right? Grandpa talks about, when do you want corn knee-high by the 4th of July? We all say, no, that's not true anymore. And I always kidded and say, we need them tasseling by, right? Tasseling by the 4th of July with corn. Well, for soybeans, for me, I want them green to the eye by the 4th of July. I want them canopied by the time we're getting to about the 4th of July, right? Across the Midwest, basically end of June, early July, we need to have that sucker canopied.
Well, that's good. I think now it's time for some fun high yield talk.
Yeah,
so,
this is it'd be fun to do a short version of this too, like just those fundamentals, because I think that 25-day thing is incredibly powerful.
It is amazing.
Think about the struggles that we're having with, I mean, you look at the EPA, the battle between 2,4-D and dicamba.
Yep.
I mean, if the entire bean belt closed 25 days earlier, what would that do for weed control? I mean, it'd be an incredible improvement. So, very good. Okay, now we can go back to your.
So moving on to the high yield talk. We've talked a lot about row spacing, population, fertilizer. Does any of this conversation change if we're going from the average rotated farm where you're expecting 65 bushel beans, give or take, to where we're coming off that 5 to 6 to 7 year continuous corn acre, or you always have that field that yields 80 to 100 bushel? Do some of these conversations change?
Yeah, I think that we still have foundations are going to be very similar, right? We're going to have the timely plantings. We're going to have the narrow rows. And it is interesting, and Andrew, you've been on these panels before too, high yield management, corn, soybeans, and everything. And then say, well, that row spacing is not matching up with that yield winner. And again, not everything's equal in those comparisons either, right? So you think about the access to water later, irrigation. That's a huge play in this, right? You think about having a growing season that you can have the full benefit of a handful of more days than what we have here in the Midwest, right? So all of those have to come into this conversation. If we're having high yield management, so you've got those nailed, you got the variety that you like, you got the seed treatment. I think what's interesting in some of our work over the years with high yield management is the system that comes into play, right? And we've all done this one product evaluations or individually do these, and systems evaluation, it's a lot of work too, right? And so there's ways to manage it, right? You can think through doing some level of, okay, I'm going to do this intense management and knock this out, omission, addition, design. So what's been interesting in the last few years for some of the work that we've done is this idea that foliar protection, right? Fungicide, insecticide, that's an easy one to go out there, R3, and run it. And some people say, I'm going to do it prophylactically. Again, high yield management is the mindset here, not necessarily profitability, whether the disease is there or not. What's been interesting to me on some of that work that we've done is that often we've gone out there, we haven't hit thresholds individually on whether it's disease or whether it's insects, and done that just by itself. But then we've also had, okay, this underpinning of timely planting and a sulfur base that's out there to help with nodulation fixation, right? So for us here locally, we're getting 8 to 11 bushels just on prairie dirt planted mid-Aprils with the sulfur to help with boosting nodulation fixation. So part of that story is that it boosts nodulation, therefore fixation. Now you have all these leaves, nice dark green, chlorophyll content, harvesting sunlight, and they hold on to their leaves much longer, right? They don't senesce nearly as early as right next door. We're talking 4% organic matter soil, black as your shirt. You know, this idea that they're senescing much earlier without that sulfur that's helping with nodulation fixation. Next level is, okay, I've got foliar protection in the mix crossed up with this. The foliar protection without the sulfur, I didn't see the benefit. When I've got the sulfur under there, I'm going in at R4. We're having the pods being retained, so then now those 1 or 2 or 3 pods that are being retained, they can actually finish filling. Versus if I didn't have that leaf structure, that leaf there, the chlorophyll and nutrient load as well as photosynthetes, we're averaging 4 to 6 bushel gains with this next level sequential kind of systems approach.
When you're talking about sulfur, and that's come up in both episodes, how much sulfur are we talking, and what form?
Yeah, so again, that's an episode of its own. But and again, not every field. Let's be clear, not every field needs it either, right? So, but I go back to this story as you've got to have your fields be your responder. In other words, you've got to say, soybean, tell me if this field is fit or not. Go back to some of the late drone imagery. That's going to help into this as well. So a good reference strip is going to be 20 pounds of sulfur in a soluble form, okay? I've really loosened this over the years. Early on when I started getting into this and seeing these responses as close to planting as possible, well, I'd say as long as that application is done within the spring, so within a month or 2 months of that planting, you're going to be fine. And again, sources, give me soluble products. So give me like ammonium sulfate or pelletized gypsum. Those are really good. I've looked at about everything that's on the market, but those are probably 2 good starting points. ETS I like because you can just throw it in the sprayer and go. It's just not as consistent as those dry spreads, so just be mindful of that. Products like Mosaics out of 1240 O10S, you know, that does well, but half of that is elemental sulfur, so that's going to take 300 to 400 days to oxidize, right? Versus the other half of that's going to be the ammonium sulfate. So those are kind of some good starting points to think about.
Yeah, that's good.
I appreciate that. So we talked a little bit about this in the science episode, but when we think about some of the things that we do, so we obviously understand the nutrient uptake curves. That's science that's getting updated, but I mean, it's old science, right? We understand that. Is there an opportunity to use some of the technology that we use in our corn crop, whether it's side dressing, wide dropping, exact dropping, to try and match up those nutrient uptake curves with maybe a practice where we'd go in and be more manipulative, especially later into the R stages?
Yeah, with this mindset that we're maybe in more that high yield management, kind of pushing the envelope, maybe not a traditional recommendation. we've looked at this, and again, I'll just kind of repeat a little bit just for this episode, that we've done this in terms of a directed spray. We've done it at R1, R3, R5. We've done foliar versions of this. And so I think on the nutrient load side, on the macro, so I'm going to go the nitrogen, I'm going to go the phosphorus, I'm going to go potassium, as well as sulfur. I just don't see that playing out. Those tools are there. It's nice. It's fun to go in with the wide drop, fun to go in a side dress. Well, hey, and again, everyone's done that, right? I've done side dress and corn. I'll go into those beans, right? Those might catch a little bit because you're probably still going to be beans that are V6 to R1, but they're not going to be the R3, R4. By that point, what you're really trying to do is build up what's already in the plant, and so then it can have access to it. I'd say the other part that that's in the corn world maybe is on the front side of it and go to the planter, right? And so not every 15-inch planter is plumbed in the same way that a 30-inch corn planter is, right? And then for good reasons. Twice as much iron, twice as much plumbing to do all that. So I think there could be some interesting work there, whether you think about some of Precision or whoever's out there in terms of placement near the row. I've done starter work on, I don't like a 2x2 on soybeans. I actually like the 2-inch on top of the ground, because in particular with the sulfur supply. So then now it's going to all roots, not just one root. It's about sulfur supply throughout the rooting system, not just one root to help the plant. It's about helping the nodulation of the bacteria.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If I've got my foundation, the things we've talked about, I'm integrating sulfur. What about other micros, boron or other things? If I feel like I'm doing the rest of that stuff well, is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, I think what I like to do in this high yield management is to, again, let the plant be my roadmap. There is some caution with that, and what I mean by that is if you take leaf samples, and a lot of people, I'm taking weekly and I'm adjusting, I'm looking at sap. The jury's still out, in my opinion, on some of that. But I think that we can start to fine-tune and say, okay, catching a trend, are we starting to get light in something that we can manage in a foliar way or in an irrigated way? And so I think about micros. Those are an easy one for the most part to adjust with the foliar spray. You don't need it nearly as much to do that. Manganese is a big one for us, right? And we think about we can do foliar sprays to adjust that easily. I mentioned a macronutrient, potassium, but in particular, a lot of people talked about, okay, it's not as much potassium for the masses, but it's potassium, and it's a potassium acetate to help with maybe a little with stobatal conductance and water supply. So there might could be some play there as well.
Well, I think the final question before you get your fun wrap-up question, what commonly, we start talking limiting factors, whether we're going from 60 to 80 or 80 to 100 bushel. Do you see anything being like any specific nutrient management, anything being more of a common limiting factor when we start going from 60 to 100 bushel?
Common between the two? Is that what you just said?
Yeah, maybe that was worded wrong. Do you see limiting factors change, or if so, what's one of the common ones that you see?
Yeah, so when I think about an average 60 bushel kind of field versus an 80 to 90, I go back to the limiting factors. You're going small, but group of small with the high yielding management. And so what I mean by that is this one change has multiple effects. And so then I had this buildup of a nutrient supply that's affecting nodulation and nitrogen supply. You have this rooting system, and so this access to water. And so you've gotten out a deep rooting system, so then you can manage that up, right? Versus, okay, if I've got a compromised rooting system, I've got some issues with sidewall compaction, you're just not going to be able to manage your way out of that. Versus you've got, okay, I've got a good rooting system, I can start to build on, okay, now I've got leaves that are nice, strong concentration of chlorophyll, a good photosynthetic capacity. They're holding on later. What's the next thing I can do to push that a little bit further?
Yeah.
That's a really good answer. And it's comprehensive, right? It's not as simple as just pulling one lever or the other. This is an interesting question, and I think we came off of a year where probably for the first time we saw 2-pass fungicide in corn have a pretty big response. Obviously, pretty unique to a crazy growing season. When you talk about retaining plant tissue and retaining the photosynthetic area of the plant, is there any advantage to 2-pass fungicide extending the life of the soybean that way?
Yeah, and when we think about it, you can put some catchphrases to it, stay green or leaf retention, all these kind of things. And so if you're going with the fungicide story, is there disease present or not? Let's start there, right? And if it's not there, now we're just talking, is there some level of physiological effect? And, there's some documentation on that on the single pass. And I already mentioned that we've done this for years. A lot of agronomists do this and say, I don't see the benefit out of that. And if I do a second application, what is our target in doing that? And I think I go back to setting the stage for pod retention. Like for me, I actually target later. So I prefer on this fungicide story, a lot of the industry goes R3, and good for good reason, right? That's first pod, and you think about the window of thousands to millions of acres. It depends on the retailer we're talking about to cover, right? And you get the weather that does or doesn't happen. But when I look physiologically, my work, we look at R4, right? And that's when we target our applications of just a single, right? And reason being, go back to some of the work that we talked about. What's going on later in the season with our modern lines? There's a straight linear increase with nutrient loads of nitrogen, sulfur, dry matter accumulation in the seeds. And so what can I do to help that period with being as efficient as possible? So I go a little bit later, and I can do that, right? I'm a scientist in this way, and I can be as targeted as it's just R4 versus the industry. If the industry said, I'm going to do R4, well, they're going to get at the R4. It'll be R4.5. It'll be R5, and you've missed the window, right? But as far as if you're really trying to get to the gnat's whisker of this, I think that's part of the deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this has been good.
Yeah, it's excellent, and I think so many good things to chew on. We have spent probably the last 30 days or so really pushing people to remember that your corn and soybeans don't know the commodity price. They don't know the interest rate. They know, and I think for me, I want to incorporate this idea of the soybean foundations into those conversations, right? As the soybean doesn't know what it's worth. Right. It certainly doesn't know, what a tariff is or what the current interest rate is, right? It just knows the condition around it. So, again, super grateful for your willingness to share these best management practices with us, and I know our listeners will appreciate that. One of our favorite questions to book in the episode. We've teased you a little bit about your wisdom. The wisdom.
Well, I brought it on to myself, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe that's a sign of getting old that you start talking about yourself in the third person.
Back in my day, Sonny.
Yeah.
I can see a couple maybe memes or maybe a future shirt coming with a little,
a little whiskers,
old man winter in it. But
now he's got two shirts coming. Corn is a diva, and then
yeah, that's right.
We've been talking about that forever.
Thinking about your years of research, I guess, and your answer at the beginning of our episode around what you've appreciated as the people in agriculture, and that's a really great answer. But I guess thinking about your contribution to this space, what's something you're really proud of that you've thought just had a cool impact on agriculture?
We've mentioned it throughout here, and it's nothing of my doing. It's just I try to do something that helps the grower, and so you just luck out, right? And so one of the fun things was these old lines to new, and just to see how those have changed. So that history, I do have a little bit, not just that I have the gray whiskers, but I do have that nostalgic gene. I've got, five file cabinets that are 4 drawers each in my office with hundreds of years of just documentation, right? And so I pulled out, a publication, Soybean as a New Crop, 1899 publication, right? Wow. And so just learning about that, and then to actually look at a 1928 Illini, and then to look at the Williams, and then to look at Harris Soy, and all those, and the modern ones. And so that was just such a fascinating time to look at those beans and how they've changed and developed and grow them in today's environment, right? And then say, yeah, we have changed, or it wasn't the agronomists, it was the breeders, whether they knew they were doing it or not. This yield advantage that they've gained is, okay, we got seed fill that's occurring later, and then now as a manager, as an agronomist, how can I utilize that? And so that's been awesome to be a part of. And then the part of stumbling into it is, the sulfur work. I stumbled into it in 2015. We had 20 inches of rain in June, right? And we had plenty of fields that just looked nasty. They were saturated conditions. They were the off-green color, right? I talk about soybeans at V3. They're going through the awkward stage of life. That's just every year, right? They're going to be that off-green. But these were just off-green. So what can I do to rescue those? We talked about plant hormones. I brought in, plant hormones that had IBA and an IAA, right? All these plant hormones that help with roots, and that should help there. It's like, well, maybe there's a nitrogen supply. And I just happened to throw in ammonium sulfate in that, and then just said all of a sudden, like, ooh, we got 6 bushels on that. We brought it back to life, and then now all of a sudden now we've got this opportunity that we've got fields here just a mile down the road. April 18th, 77 bushel beans went to 99 bushels just by adding sulfur on a prairie dirt.
Wow.
And that's not every field, right? But
Right,
I mean,
right,
but
right.
You factor in the environmental conditions, though.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, who in the world? So again, something to be proud of in those aha moments. And again, I lucked into it. Is you talk about soybean yield response. If we were 5 to 7 bushel response to a treatment or management, we're usually ecstatic.
Absolutely.
We're talking 10, 12. 22 bushels, 12 to 22 bushel responses with some of these treatments, and so it's pretty remarkable to have that time.
That's cool.
I really appreciate the answer, and I will tell you that something that I have been continually impressed by, and I am today, is just the passion, right? Because you said you lucked into it.
Yep.
But it's the eagerness and the passion and the drive, that you're out there trying to solve those problems. I know something that I've appreciated about Andrew is I'll ask him a question about something, and he's got a iPad or whatever, and he'll start flipping through, and I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes,
Sure.
So thinking about your file cabinet, and that passion is what drives great
You're
agronomy,
talking
right?
about my nerd book.
Yeah,
that I
your
had
nerd
Bilo
book.
signed.
I'm going to steal that from you at some point.
My
but
nerd book. I got a nerd book with all my just like cool facts on corn and soybeans
Sure.
that I've gathered throughout grad school and just
Yeah.
reading books. And then one of my things I've always looked up to Fred, him and Bilo and Westgate.
Yep.
And so when we interviewed Bilo, I had him sign my nerd
That's
book.
awesome.
and
It was pretty
monograph it,
cool.
yeah. But I was incredibly appreciative of the passion, because it's going to make a huge impact on all the people that are choosing to chime in and listen to this
Sure.
and thinking about these things, and so greatly appreciate that. Our show is called A Penny for Your Thoughts. Sometimes I regret that, but at the end of our show, I like to cash in my penny.
I think we made the joke. We never planned on this getting big at all. I think we'd probably think of a less stupid name if we knew. It was,
Correct.
Maybe
Well,
the
at
name
least
is
a
what
less,
made it, right?
At least a less vain one. At least somebody might in the future know I contributed at some point. But at the end of our show, we like to cash in our penny, and I like to ask our guests to grade the report.
Absolutely.
So you'll have an opportunity to be critical of Mr. Penny here. But Andrew, succinct takeaways from today's episode.
Yeah, I had a lot of good information listening to Shaun. The very first one that stood out to me is, we often have conversations with growers about, the preference on a tall versus a short plant, right? And Shaun had some really good information. He likes a nice compact plant.
When you
And
say Shaun, are you talking about me? Or
The correct spelling.
Oh,
Shaun.
the other one.
We'll say Shaun.
Shaun.
You could say like the Shaun, right?
Yeah,
we get
the
a little,
Shaun.
yeah,
There we go.
The Shaun. He talked about light penetration and the impact that a tall plant might have on shading out. You start getting the height to a soybean plant, you can start shading out those lower leaves. And I mean, same conversation with the corn, right? How important is that lower canopy of corn? It's very similar. So that was pretty interesting. Think about getting that nice shorter plant. You mentioned lower seeding rates can also impact that. Planting date, obviously, just like corn, it's going to, the earlier you plant, the shorter your internodes are going to be due to the temperatures. So that's something to think about as we continue to have those conversations around standability and maybe, maximizing yield, not wanting those lower pods to abort, right? The other thing that really stood out is just something I think we need to talk more about is pH, right? How we got anhydrous ammonia going on spots, and that really impacts our pH. And you mentioned you like low 6s, and you start. I think a lot of people know that, but one thing you touched on was, you start getting to the mid 5s, that starts impacting bradyrhizobia, and we don't talk about it enough. Soybeans need a lot of nitrogen, right? And we know that they fix their own nitrogen to a point. But we need a lot of nitrogen. If that relationship isn't working properly, that's going to impact yield. And then you had a good question, Shaun, not the Shaun, talking about planting depth.
I got one.
There you go.
We have those conversations quite a bit. Whether we're in a extremely dry year or an extremely wet year like we've had this year. Back in the spring. You mentioned your ideal planting date was depth was 1.5
inch and a half, inch and 3/4,
inch and a half, give or take. But inch is a little bit too shallow.
I think it is, yeah.
And one of the things that I really appreciated about that is, and again, elaborating in the nerd portion, you talked about nodulation and the impact you can have if you are too shallow, and that's something that I don't think we've really talked about. And so I think that's really good.
These are
really
things
good
that,
insight.
as you bring that up, these are things that you're not going to know, right? You're not you go out the field and you're going to say, I planted an inch, those beans look fine. you're not going to have that it's firing at the bottom like a corn plant, right? You're not going to know that you're getting sold short on that, right? So those are the things that are just so frustrating too, but it's like understand what are your targets and what impact, if you miss those targets, can have on your crop.
Yeah, I really like that. So that's something new to add to it. So maybe get more prescriptive, we'll say treating soybeans like corn as we continue to
watch it,
increase
that
yield.
diva crop.
Hey, it's a good thing, right? We
No.
want to make soybeans great again. We want to push yields and see what these things.
Soybeans.
we want to.
I think the soybeans have been great. I mean, they're the ones that are making the money.
The last one is, and maybe this isn't anything new. We're all experiencing this across the Corn Belt. This whole idea of planting soybeans, right? It's not just a conversation anymore. This is stuff going on. We're seeing the yield impact.
Yep.
The one thing that I really like you touching on, and we discussed this. Spreading your maturity, right?
Yep.
It's not necessarily about not harvesting 10% soybeans at harvest, but it's about spreading your risk, spreading that maturity, so that if conditions are good, you might see that. But at the end of the day, it's about spreading your risk. So I really like this conversation. I learned a lot as always, and really appreciated the time.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well.
Does he get a passing grade if it's a pass-fail?
Oh, okay, good. I don't have to give an actual
No,
grade.
no, we don't have to give
Yeah, he passes. He passes. All right.
Yeah,
Conditional.
kept good notes. The two things I'd add to that one, I really like the planting depth piece, and I think we talk about how resilient the soybean is, and it can
adapt.
It can adapt so many things. It can't fix that, right? So that is something that there's a great takeaway. I also think the residue piece is going to continue to be a really important conversation, and I feel like a lot of our guests are working really hard on that. So really appreciate that, and then. As we get ready to sign off, again, just want to express gratitude for taking the time to spend with us today. Thank you for hosting us on campus. Our teaser probably isn't going to be quite as teasing because I think
they won't know who, but they'll know
well, that's
where.
true.
Right?
Yeah. So I guess for the sake of keeping the cadence of the show, give our guests a teaser about where we're going next.
Yeah. The one cool thing about this is, I give a lot of credit to Purdue. They are doing some phenomenal stuff, and being an Iowa State guy myself, it's there's a few ag colleges that really stand out year over year, and man, I couldn't be, I don't think it's a cooler moment to be here talking with some of these guys at Purdue and gals. They got a phenomenal team here.
There's a teaser right there.
Yeah, there's a teaser. We're staying here at Purdue. We're going to talk about nitrogen and some digital agriculture coming up.
Yeah, cool things. Once again, thank you. We appreciate you. Look forward to our listeners getting to learn a lot about this stuff. So thanks again.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks
Shaun.
Shaun.
Thanks, Shaun.